Do we hold to that? Do we believe that? Wouldn't that, if we talk about the monarchy of the Father, doesn't that lower the status of the Son? Well, what is the monarchy of the Father there, Dr. Goff? And is it okay as a Catholic to emphasize that?
Yes, I think it's very clear that every theological tradition affirms the monarchy of the Father. Whether or not you're going to be Franciscan, Bonaventura Scotist, or Thomist, even Occamist, if that's still a valid option, which is debatable. But clearly, everyone affirms the monarchy of the Father.
Yeah.
There is a dispute, however, in terms of the theological or philosophical theological explanation of how that monarchy works out between the Thomistic account and the Franciscan account. Now, I would argue that the Franciscan account more easily and more consistently leads back to a more robust and complete affirmation of the monarchy of the Father.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of the acceptance of the claim, both systems affirm it. It's just the way in which they get to that affirmation. I think there is greater harmony between the Franciscan approach and, say, the Cappadocian approach, somebody like St. Gregory Nazianzen, than the Thomistic approach. But nevertheless, the monarchy of the Father is a dogma of the faith, insofar as the Father is the sole source of the Trinity, and as sole source of the Trinity, even though the Trinity acts in common ad extra with respect to creation and sanctifying grace, the Father is still the radical source of even the actions of the Trinity as common, because he's the source of the Son and the Spirit as originative fontal plenitude. So yes, the Catholic position is to affirm the monarchy of the Father. It just becomes more debatable whether or not you're consistently affirming this and taking it as a first principle if you emphasize, as St. Thomas does, subsisting opposed relations as the constitutive element of personal properties, namely fatherhood, paternity, filiation, and spiration, or you affirm the order of origins and the mode of origination as the constitutive aspect or primary characteristics of personal properties. Clearly, St. Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and St. Thomas will all affirm that there are subsisting relations, even subsisting opposed relations, because they all affirm the filioque, at least in the through the Son sense.
Right.
But there will be a difference in terms of how that works out in a theological account of whether or not you begin with subsisting relations and you reason back to persons, or you begin with the Father as the sole source, and then via an analysis of the modes of origination of the Son and the Spirit, then you arrive at subsisting relations. So it's a different way of proceeding. Both are valid within the Catholic tradition, but obviously the paradigm one selects is the paradigm one thinks is more adequate and more likely to be the case. But that's as distinct from the dogmatic affirmation. And so, yeah, I actually forgot the initial question, but
you were great on it. It was the monarchy of the Father, and I totally agree. In fact, I think as a Catholic, if you deny that, you're going to run into a lot of problems when dialoguing, talking about the apostolic and the ante-Nicene fathers. They affirm it. I think you're going to run into a big problem.
Absolutely.
There. Right.
Yeah, and it's East and West, because even someone like Saint Hilary of Poitiers, although I think he actually was a Greek, but came West. But somebody that early on, he very clearly distinguishes between the authority, or arche, or principle, or fontal place of the Father vis-a-vis the Son. So the Father has an authority a se, from himself and from no one, that then when he generates the Son, he communicates his divine being in all perfections except for fatherhood to the Son. Well, then the Son has a sub-authority. Now, that could be understood in a subordinationist sense, but I think St. Hilary was simply saying that the authority the Son has comes directly and solely from the Father, that the Father has from no one else. And so it's really the it turns upon the very difficult question of how do you understand principle, or arche, or cause in a relationship of order between persons who have the same essence, because clearly cause here, or principle, or arche, or origin, cannot mean making or perfecting or being the formal constituent of what this thing is, because each of the persons of the Trinity are simply God.
Yeah.
But yet there is an order, and there is a generation and procession from the Father. So the Father truly is the agent who communicates, but he doesn't make the Son, if you get that distinction, because the Son is the same infinite essence of the Father.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think the real question is where the debates should be is not where the Thomists or the Franciscans or the Paulamites or the Cappadocians come down on the affirmation of the monarchy of the Father. It's actually how they explain or give an account for the monarchy of the Father. And I think that's where there are relative advantages to a more Cappadocian or Franciscan approach than the Thomistic approach. But in terms of the affirmation of the dogmatic truth, they're all affirming the same thing. It's just, is their affirmation consistent with their account, or is their account consistent with their affirmation?
That are great points you make there, and I think of the utilization of arche in Scripture, and when one thing comes to mind immediately, it'd be Revelation 3:14, where it's talking about Christ as the arche, but not talking about him as being a part of creation, as you know very well. It's utilizing that in a very different manner. He is, as Saint Justin Martyr would call him, he calls him the commander of creation, not a part of creation. I think it really does depend on how you look at that terminology, how it's being utilized, and you make a number of really good points there. The one point that I really appreciated was of Hilary of Poitiers, and it reminds me of Athanasius of Alexandria, who utilizes very similar language as well. Yet that language, when they're talking about the Son, they're not utilizing it to make the Son subordinate in the manner in which Arius was doing, Arianism, or any of these other heretical groups. They weren't making him subordinate in nature, and I think that's a really good distinction to make.